If you find yourself swimming in information, you will eventually drown in lies. No matter how good the information is, it's coming from some biased perspective. And one of the biggest biased perspectives that we ever engaged in, me and everybody else who's alive today, is Western propaganda. Now, the worst thing about Western propaganda is the lies they tell about how the world came together and how people cooperated and didn't cooperate in the past. For example, if you were to read a lot of books, you would think that Japan was some isolated place far away from every other place in history. Now, from the perspective of the Europeans, as you can see, they're very, very far away from Japan, and it would be an exotic land, really, the world far, far away, a land that just cannot be reached. But from India, China, parts of the Middle East, Russia, and even some Polynesians, Japan is a hop over. And not only that, it was well known. It was a good trade partner for a lot of these people. And not only did they go to Japan, but Japanese people regularly went to them. And I don't mean some trip like, oh my God, we got there and how did we get there and what was that foreign land that no one knows about. I'm talking about regular people going back and forth between these lands. And of course, Japan is only one area that's like this. Another one would be how the Polynesians were going back and forth between America and the Polynesian islands. This is something that has been shown because certain foods from the Americas are eventually found on Polynesian islands, and certain foods that are from the Polynesian islands are found in America. Just a back and forth movement of these places. But again, if you start from the Western perspective, just like if you started from anybody's single perspective, then you get a completely different picture of the world than what actually happened in history. Remember, Western history is not history. Western history is a single perspective of history. In the same way that if we just looked at the world through the eyes of the Middle East, then certain lands would be way more foreign than others. One of the great evidences of this is a university located in India. Its name is Nalanda University, and it existed from the 6th century all the way to the 14th century when it was destroyed by foreigners of Muslim faith. This university was one of those universities that just was beyond anything that came before its time. Why? Well, apart from the fact that it had its own students, it had a universality about it. So we find students from as far as Japan, China, Korea, Tibet, Africa, and even in some various cases, West Asia. But what kind of thing would inspire so many people from so many parts of the world to come together into one location and study together, especially this early in history? What would make them sit down with each other, break bread, talk, and learn with each other? Well, of course, religion. This was a Buddhist university. And of course, Buddhism is universal in its teachings. It's a religion designed for everybody, and anyone who's willing to learn is free to. And that's why we even get specific names left over from back then of people who came and learned. For example, Xianxiang, the traveler, who decided to go to India, study, and bring back texts from India to China for the Buddhist faith. And of course, he did this at the young age of 27. Another traveler is Jikaku Daishu, or Enin as he's called, and he traveled with a group of people from Japan just outside of Kyoto, and he went to India, which of course, remember, India as a Buddhist that he was would be like the Mecca for Buddhist people. Another person is Hei Cho. I don't know how to say the name properly, but he was another important figure is Hei Cho, who traveled as far as India and also made it to Nalanda University taking scripts. But not only that, he traveled even further to other parts of the Middle East. This text here speaks about his trip to the Turks. Now, those are only the direct associations or the people who we know directly went to this university and traveled from their lands. But there's also so many other connections with other places with this university and other Buddhist texts. For example, there is a religion that started in Egypt that embraces a mixture of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. An early example of a Buddha statue found in Egypt, this is one of the earliest ones found, is called Berenike Buddha. It's a statue that is found in Egypt and it shows the similarities or the connections between Egypt and the Buddhist faith. Now, obviously, the connection here was the fact that there was the Roman Empire and all of that. I'm not saying that this proves that they were connected in a deeper way than this, but it does prove that people and the universality of Buddhism was already spreading as far as places like Africa. In fact, Aksum is known to have been involved in some very small ways with Buddhism, though it's almost as vague as Egypt. So let's read from Wikipedia. The Baranika Buddha is a statue of the Buddha parts of which were discovered in January 2018 and January 2022 in an archaeological excavation in the ancient harbor of Baranika, Egypt, by an American Polish archaeologist mission. The statue was discovered in the forecast on the forecourt of an early Roman period temple dedicated to the goddess Isis. The statue is the first statue of the Buddha to ever be found west of Afghanistan. It attests to the extent of Indo Roman relations in the early centuries of the Common Era. Based on the stylistic details and the context of the excavation, it is thought that the statue was made in Alexandria around the 2nd century CE. According to Stephen Sidebotham, a history professor at the University of Delaware, who is co-director of the Berenike project, the statue dates to between 90 and 140 CE. It was made from a stone that was extracted south of Istanbul and may also have been carved in Berenike itself. The statue has a halo around the head of the Buddha decorated with the rays of the sun and has a lotus flower by the side. It is 71 centimeters tall. The excavations at Berenike also yielded other artifacts related to ancient India. An inscription in Sanskrit dated to the Roman Emperor Philip the Arab, as well as Satavahana coins dated to the 2nd century CE. They also discovered inscriptions in Greek, including one below the Sanskrit inscription, something Rodney asked the researcher from Heidelberg University who discovered the Buddha figure says is unique in Egypt. It's probable that the statue were carved in Berenice, and without a doubt the inscription too. So the place had artisans capable of making those objects and people interested in ordering them, explains asked, who also points out that the discovery raises new questions. What does it mean to make an offering of a Buddha statue in a Roman temple to Isis in Egypt? It is a topic that will keep anthropologists, historians, and other busy for a while, he says. Various fragmentary parts of the Buddha statue, torso heads, had already been discovered at Berenike in 2019. Some made a local gypsum. So you can see there that obviously there was some kind of movement already from Buddhism during the Roman period. And not only this, but there is some evidence that shows that with the influence of the Romans, who were influenced by the Greeks, who were influenced by the Egyptians, some of the statues of the Buddhists and stuff like that might have been influenced by those very same Romans. So, influence all around. So, is this the great revelation that there was a university in India and that it might have influenced several other places in the world at the time? Is that all that we have to offer from the history that is outside of the West from this specific university? Well, no. We actually offer one of the biggest mathematicians in history who influenced not only the Indians, but he also influenced the later scholars that would come in from the Islamic Golden Age, and we know who they influenced. And how exactly did this mathematician do this? Well, firstly, let's break this down. He was a local of India. His name was Aryabhata, and he was very influential and did a whole bunch of things. He basically was one of those people who was, how do I put this? An Einstein meets Isaac Newton meets Nikola Tesla type of character. For his time, what he knew was unbelievable. And it's even speculated that he might have, you know, been given credit for by several other people. But he is a genius. One of the first things that he did mathematically was introduce the number zero. Huge improvement. Now, interestingly, he did not use the number zero as much as people think that he did, but he did introduce it as a place value. Think about that. That number did not exist anywhere in the world except in the Americas, which no one had contact with. And here he is, the first person to introduce it, making maths simpler forever. And then, of course, he did the next thing, which was already done by Archimedes, which was working with pi and realizing that it was an irrational number. Then he introduced trigonometry and several other things. He also worked with algebra, but like I said, algebra is old, but he did improvements on algebra. Of course, he did astronomy, because why wouldn't you? Solar systems and worked with all kinds of stuff. I don't have to sit down and go through everything he did, but he was a goddamn scientist, the highest of his time. Probably for the next 300 years after him, there was no one to even compare. Now you're probably thinking, why do we have more evidence of Buddhism in China, Japan, India, Tibet, and all these other places in the Asian side of things rather than Africa? Well, even though I've showed you evidence that Buddhism quite early entered Africa, it didn't really take, did it? The two religions that would overtake everything in Africa would be Christianity and Islam. And because of their fights and fights with other religions, there was no space for Buddhism. It was merely something to be looked at, and even the small amounts of Axumites who converted to Buddhism, it didn't last long. And so these Nalanda University students who probably came from outside did not exactly have a long history. See, one of the reasons why we know who went to Nalanda University is because they carried texts back to their own countries. And even though a lot was destroyed in Nalanda University, we still have some from outside glorifying this one university. This university that came way before the Islamic universities that would make the whole world fear their education systems. Aryabhata influenced many Muslims, and those Muslims even gave credit to Aryabhata, including some of the early mathematicians and Muslims. I thought about adding them, but let's not do that. But this brings me to my final point, and it's a very important one, that science, maths, and all that stuff belongs to nobody. And sharing in this thing is the most important thing. So instead of looking at science as some kind of race, as some kind of who wins, it's more like a relay where you pass the baton from one to the other, and information must be shared. If you don't pass the baton, I don't get to run the race. But if I don't wait for you to use your time, then we don't win either. But unlike a relay race, we're not competing against each other. No nations were really competing. I mean, look how the Greeks influenced so many people from around the world, and then how they themselves were influenced by so many people from around the world, including people from Asia and Africa, places that, previously were denied as great influences. And I'm talking about Far East. Those places influenced these places. Is it bad? Is it a bad thing that what we consider human intelligence is something shared within all humans, and it's not something that can be credited to one person or one group or one section of human beings, but instead it's a long chain? And speaking of long chains, this is not the final thing to say about the connection between Africa, Asia, Europe together in a university in India. This is the earliest. There would be several more in the future that would help in information. Remember, there is no one land that did everything all at once. Even if we go back to the furthest time, we find the Sumerians, Egyptians, and the Indus Valley existing right there, quite intelligent, and sharing with their local partners. So that's the reality. And so the West, don't allow it to give you this version of history. Don't allow it to give you this version of history where the most important players are Westerners who bring the world together. No, the world was already brought together. Japan was not an unknown island. It was unknown to the Europeans, and the Europeans only.